The morning light filtered through the gauze curtains of our bedroom, casting delicate shadows across the hardwood floor. I stretched beneath the Egyptian cotton sheets David had insisted we needed, feeling the familiar weight of my grandmother's necklace against my throat. It was my morning ritual, touching the small pendant that had belonged to 3 generations of women in my family, a tiny anchor that connected me to something larger than myself. David was already gone as usual. His side of the bed bore only the faintest impression, and his coffee mug sat abandoned on the nightstand, a ring of brown staining the oak surface. In the 3 years we'd lived together, I had grown accustomed to his early departures, his long hours at the architecture firm, his weekend conferences that seemed to multiply like rabbits. Success requires sacrifice, Elena, he would say, kissing my forehead with lips that tasted of ambition and coffee. We're building something beautiful together. I believed him. God help me. I believed every word. The apartment we shared in the heart of downtown reflected David's aesthetic. Clean lines, expensive furniture, and an absence of anything that might be considered sentimental clutter. My few personal touches felt like intruders in his carefully curated space. The quilt my mother had made, a small collection of books with worn spines, and the photographs I'd managed to display despite his subtle disapproval. Photography is so personal, he'd said, when I hung a black and white picture of my grandmother in the hallway. Don't you think guests might find it intimate? I should have seen the signs then. The way he flinched when I mentioned family traditions. How he changed the subject whenever I spoke about my grandmother's stories. The almost physical discomfort he displayed when I wore the necklace to his work functions. It's just so old-fashioned, he'd murmured once, his fingers brushing the delicate chain. Wouldn't you prefer something more contemporary? Something that matches your beauty? But the necklace wasn't about beauty. It was about legacy, about the women who had worn it before me, about the stories embedded in its small silver pendant engraved with a tiny rose. My grandmother had given it to me on my 16th birthday, her arthritis-gnarled fingers trembling as she fastened the clasp. This belonged to my grandmother, and her grandmother before that, she had whispered, her voice carrying the weight of decades. It's not valuable in the way the world measures these things, Elena, but it carries something more precious than gold. The strength of the women who wore it, the love they carried, the dignity they maintained no matter what storms came their way. At 32, I understood what she meant in ways my 16-year-old self couldn't have comprehended. That Tuesday morning in September started like any other, but looking back, I can see how the universe was preparing to shift beneath my feet. I made my coffee in the sleek machine David had imported from Italy, ate my breakfast of Greek yogurt and berries at the marble kitchen island, and checked my phone for messages. Nothing from David, which wasn't unusual. He'd been particularly distant lately, claiming stress from a major project. I worked from home as a freelance grant writer for nonprofit organizations, a career choice that David tolerated rather than celebrated. It's admirable, your desire to help people, he would say in a tone that suggested it was anything but. Though I do hope you'll consider something more financially substantial eventually. Money had never been my primary motivation, much to his bewilderment. I found meaning in helping small organizations secure funding for their missions. A women's shelter here, a literacy program there, a community garden in an underserved neighborhood. Each grant I helped secure felt like a small victory against the world's indifference. Around 11 that morning, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, my college roommate and closest friend. Coffee later, I have news. Sarah worked in marketing for a boutique firm downtown, and her news was usually about some social media campaign or her latest dating disaster. But something in the brevity of her message made me pause. Sarah was never brief. Sure, usual place at 2? Perfect. The heart emoji should have been a warning. Sarah reserved emotional punctuation for serious occasions. I spent the rest of the morning working on a grant proposal for a domestic violence shelter, the irony of which would become apparent later. The work absorbed me completely, researching statistics, crafting narratives that would move donors to action, building bridges between need and resources. It was work that mattered, work that made me feel connected to something larger than David's world of glass towers and profit margins. At 1:45, I grabbed my purse and headed to Café Luna, the small coffee shop where Sarah and I had been meeting for the past 5 years. The owner, Mrs. Chen, knew our orders by heart and always saved our favorite corner table, the one with mismatched chairs and a view of the small urban garden behind the shop. Sarah was already there when I arrived, her auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger than her 31 years. But her face carried an expression I'd rarely seen, a mixture of sadness and resolve that made my stomach tighten. "Elena," she said, standing to hug me. Her embrace lasted longer than usual, and I felt her hands tremble slightly against my back. "Sarah, you're scaring me. What's wrong?" She pulled back, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "Sit down, honey, please." I sank into the familiar chair, my hands automatically reaching for the necklace. It was a gesture Sarah had seen thousands of times, my unconscious way of seeking comfort. "I don't know how to say this," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been debating whether to tell you for weeks, but I can't keep it to myself anymore. You deserve to know." "Know what?" The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm, too close. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. With shaking fingers, she scrolled through something, then turned the screen toward me. "I was at the Harbor District Art Gallery opening last Friday, the one for emerging artists that my firm was promoting." Her words came out in a rush, as if speed might soften the blow. "I saw David there." "Okay," I said slowly. David occasionally attended cultural events for work, though he usually mentioned them. He didn't tell me he was going, but— "Elena." Sarah's voice cut through my rationalization. "He wasn't alone." The image on her phone came into focus gradually, like a photograph developing in slow motion. David, wearing the navy suit I'd helped him pick out for his birthday, his arm around a woman I didn't recognize. She was beautiful in a sharp, angular way, blonde hair cut in a precise bob, expensive dress that hugged her tall frame, and a smile that spoke of confidence and success. But it wasn't the woman that made my world tilt sideways. It was what she was wearing around her neck. My grandmother's necklace, the delicate silver chain I touched every morning, the small rose pendant that had been passed down through 4 generations of women in my family, the heirloom that connected me to my history. It rested against this stranger's throat like it belonged there. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. "I'm so, so sorry." The coffee shop continued its normal rhythms around us. The hiss of the espresso machine, conversations blending into white noise, the gentle clink of cups against saucers. But I felt separated from it all, viewing the scene through thick glass. "When was this taken?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and controlled. "Friday night, Elena, there's more." Sarah swiped to another photo, this one showing David leaning down to kiss the woman's cheek, his hand resting possessively on her waist. I followed them outside, they got into his car together. I stared at the phone until the images blurred. Questions crowded my mind. Who was she? How long had this been going on? When had he taken my necklace? But underneath the confusion and disbelief, a deeper truth was crystallizing. David had given away the most precious thing I owned to another woman. "Elena, say something, please." I looked up at Sarah, who was watching me with the careful expression of someone expecting an explosion. But I felt strangely calm, as if I were floating above the scene, observing rather than experiencing. "I need to go home," I said, standing with movements that felt mechanical. "I'll come with you." "No." The word came out sharper than I intended. "No, I need to do this alone." Sarah nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. "Call me. When you're ready, call me." I left the coffee shop without ordering, walking the 8 blocks home with steps that grew more determined with each stride. The September afternoon was crisp, the kind of weather that usually lifted my spirits. But I felt nothing except a growing sense of clarity, as if someone had adjusted the focus on a blurry lens. David was home when I arrived, which surprised me. He sat at his laptop at the dining room table, still wearing his work clothes, his dark hair slightly mussed. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment I searched his face for signs of guilt or deception. But he just smiled, the same smile he'd been giving me for 3 years. "Hey, beautiful, how was coffee with Sarah?" "Illuminating," I said, setting my purse on the counter. Something in my tone made him look at me more carefully. "Everything okay?" I walked to the bedroom, David's footsteps following behind me. At my dresser, I opened my jewelry box, a simple wooden one my father had made, and looked at the small collection inside. Everything was there except the one piece that mattered most. Elena, what are you looking for? I turned to face him, and in that moment, I saw him clearly for perhaps the first time. The handsome features that had attracted me, the confident posture that had once made me feel protected, the expensive clothes that had seemed sophisticated. It all looked different now, like a costume worn by an actor playing a role. My grandmother's necklace, I said simply. The change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around his eyes, a slight stiffening of his shoulders. I haven't seen it. Did you misplace it? No, David, I didn't misplace it. He sat on the edge of the bed, and I noticed how he avoided meeting my eyes. I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm asking directly, where is my grandmother's necklace? The silence stretched between us, filled with 3 years of small compromises, ignored red flags, and my own willingness to make excuses for behavior that should have been inexcusable. Finally, David sighed. Elena, we need to talk. We need to talk. 4 words that signal the end of everything, though I'd been too naive to recognize their power before this moment. David patted the bed beside him, a gesture that struck me as both presumptuous and pathetic. Instead, I remained standing, my hand unconsciously reaching for the necklace that wasn't there. I'd rather stand, thank you. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing but now recognized as calculated, a way to buy time while he decided how much truth to reveal. This isn't how I wanted you to find out. Find out what exactly? About Jessica. Jessica. So the woman had a name. Something about hearing it made the betrayal more real, more concrete. She wasn't just a beautiful stranger in a photograph anymore. She was Jessica, someone David had been sharing intimate moments with, someone who now wore my most precious possession. How long? I asked. Elena. How long, David? He looked up at me, and I saw something I'd never seen in his eyes before. Genuine remorse. Not the calculated regret of someone caught in a lie, but actual sorrow. It should have made me feel better. Instead, it made everything worse. 8 months. 8 months. I calculated backward, remembering the subtle changes I'd attributed to work stress, the longer hours, the weekend conferences, the growing emotional distance. 8 months ago, we'd been planning a vacation to Spain. 8 months ago, I'd been researching engagement rings, thinking David was just taking his time to propose. Where did you meet her? At the Morrison project launch. She's an interior designer. Of course she was. Beautiful, successful, and probably shared David's appreciation for clean lines and expensive taste. Everything I wasn't in his carefully curated world. And my necklace? This question hung in the air like smoke, and I watched David struggle to find words that might somehow make the theft of my family heirloom seem reasonable. She admired it when she saw it in the photographs around the apartment. She said it was exactly the kind of vintage piece she'd been looking for. So you gave it to her. Elena, you have to understand. I understand perfectly. My voice remained steady, which surprised me. Inside, I felt like I was breaking apart, but my words came out clear and controlled. You stole my grandmother's necklace and gave it to your girlfriend. I didn't steal it. I thought you might not notice for a while. I was going to replace it with something nicer. The casual cruelty of this statement hit me like physical blow. He thought I might not notice, as if the necklace were just another piece of jewelry, interchangeable with any shiny trinket that caught his eye. Something nicer, I repeated, something more you, more contemporary and sophisticated. I stared at him, this man I'd shared a bed with for 3 years, whose morning coffee preferences I knew better than my own, whose dry cleaning I picked up without being asked. How had I never seen how completely he failed to understand me? David, that necklace belonged to my great-great-grandmother. It's been passed down through 4 generations of women in my family. It was the only thing my grandmother had of her own mother, who died when she was 12. When my grandmother was dying, she gave it to me and told me about the women who wore it before. Women who survived wars and poverty and heartbreak while maintaining their dignity. That necklace doesn't just represent my family history. It carries the strength of every woman who wore it. David's face shifted through several expressions: confusion, impatience, and finally, a dismissive shake of his head. Elena, it's just a piece of old silver. The sentimental value is only in your head. Only in my head. I don't mean it like that. I just think you've built up this mythology around an object. If the stories matter so much, you can pass them down without the actual necklace. I felt something inside me settle into place, like a lock clicking shut. For 3 years, I'd been trying to fit myself into David's vision of who I should be: more sophisticated, more ambitious, more aligned with his values. I'd compromised on everything from the coffee table in our living room to the career path he thought I should pursue. But this was where the compromise ended. I want it back. Elena, be reasonable. Jessica is already emotionally attached to it. I can't just ask for it back. You can't ask your girlfriend to return the necklace you stole from your live-in partner of 3 years? Don't be dramatic. I didn't steal anything. We live together. Technically, our belongings are shared. The legal audacity of this statement would have been laughable if it weren't so insulting. But it also clarified something for me. David wasn't just a cheater. He was someone who believed his desires superseded my rights, someone who could rationalize theft as sharing and betrayal as inevitable. Our belongings are shared, I said slowly. Interesting perspective. Something in my tone made him look at me more carefully. What do you mean? I mean, if our belongings are shared, then I suppose I have equal claim to everything in this apartment. Elena, don't do anything rash. We can work this out. Can we? How exactly do we work out the fact that you've been having an affair for 8 months and gave my family heirloom to your girlfriend? I never meant for it to go this far. With Jessica, I mean. It just happened. Betrayal doesn't just happen, David. It's a series of choices. You chose to pursue her. You chose to lie to me. You chose to take my necklace. You chose to give it to her. Each of those was a deliberate decision. He stood up, moving toward me with his hands outstretched, as if he could somehow physically bridge the chasm that had opened between us. I love you, Elena. I made mistakes, but I love you. No, you don't. The certainty in my voice stopped him short. You don't love me, David. You love the idea of me, the version of me that fits into your life without causing complications. You love that I take care of your dry cleaning and remember your mother's birthday and don't complain when you work late. But you don't love the woman who values a simple silver necklace more than expensive jewelry. You don't love the woman who chose grant writing over corporate law. You don't love the woman who hangs pictures of her grandmother in the hallway. That's not true, isn't it? When's the last time you asked me about my work? When's the last time you listened to one of my grandmother's stories without changing the subject? When's the last time you acted like my opinions mattered as much as yours? David opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. We both knew he couldn't. I want my necklace back, I said again. Tonight. Jessica and I are supposed to have dinner. Call her. Explain that you made a mistake. Tell her you need to return something that doesn't belong to you. She'll be devastated. She's been wearing it every day. The image of this woman wearing my grandmother's necklace every day, treating it as casually as David had given it away, made my chest tight with rage. But I kept my voice level. That's unfortunate, but it's not my problem. Elena, please, can't we find some middle ground here? Middle ground? I turned to face him fully. David, you've been cheating on me for 8 months. You gave away an irreplaceable family heirloom to your girlfriend. Exactly what middle ground are you imagining? I could end it with Jessica. We could go to counseling. I could make this right. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. He genuinely seemed to believe that the right combination of words and gestures could undo 8 months of deception, could make me forget the casual cruelty of his betrayal. You can't make this right, but you can return my necklace. And then what? We pretend this never happened? And then I leave. The words surprised me as much as they surprised him. I hadn't consciously decided to end our relationship, but hearing myself say it, I realized the decision had been made the moment I saw that photograph. You're leaving? Yes. Elena, you're in shock. You're not thinking clearly. Don't make any permanent decisions while you're emotional. I'm not emotional, David. I'm clear-headed for the first time in months, maybe years. I walked to the closet and pulled out a suitcase, the same one I'd used for our weekend trips to his parents' house in Connecticut. David watched me in silence as I began packing my clothes, moving with an efficiency that surprised us both. Where will you go? I'll figure it out. Elena, this is your home too. I paused in my packing, a silk blouse half folded in my hands. No, it's not. It's your home. I've been a long-term house guest with benefits. That's not fair. Isn't it? Whose name is on the lease? Who chose the furniture? Who decides what art goes on the walls? This has always been your space, David. I've just been living in it. The truth of this statement settled over both of us. In 3 years of cohabitation, I'd never felt like an equal partner in our domestic life. I'd adapted to his preferences, his schedule, his vision of what our shared space should look like. Even my few personal touches felt like accommodations he'd grudgingly allowed rather than welcomed additions. I never wanted you to feel that way. I know, but that doesn't change how I do feel. I continued packing, choosing items carefully. My clothes, my books, my few pieces of meaningful jewelry. I left behind the expensive gifts David had given me, the designer handbag I'd never felt comfortable carrying, the sleek watch that didn't match my style, the pearls that were too formal for my taste. They belonged to the version of me he'd been trying to create, not the woman I actually was. What about us? David asked as I zipped the suitcase closed. 3 years, Elena. Don't they mean anything to you? I looked at him, really looked, and tried to find some remnant of the feelings I'd carried for so long. But where love used to be, I found only a kind of sad clarity. They mean something. They taught me what I don't want in a relationship. They taught me the difference between being loved and being convenient. They taught me that compromise shouldn't require losing yourself. Elena, get my necklace back, David. Have it here when I come to get the rest of my things this weekend. I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the door, then turned back. One more thing. When you explain this to people, to your friends, your colleagues, your parents, don't make me the villain. Don't say I overreacted or couldn't forgive a mistake. You didn't make a mistake, David. You made 8 months of calculated choices. Own them. Sarah's apartment was a testament to controlled chaos. Books stacked on every surface, half-finished art projects covering the dining table, and a collection of plants in various stages of either thriving or dying. It was the opposite of David's sterile precision, and walking into it felt like stepping into a warm embrace. I brought wine, I said, holding up a bottle of the cheap Merlot we'd been drinking since college. Sarah took one look at my suitcase and pulled me into a hug that lasted long enough for me to finally let my guard down. The tears I'd been holding back since the coffee shop finally came, not the dramatic sobs of heartbreak movies, but quiet streams that felt like release. I'm proud of you, Sarah whispered into my hair. For what? For getting cheated on? For being too naive to see what was happening right in front of me? For walking away with your head held high? For not begging him to stay? For demanding your necklace back? We sat on her overstuffed couch, a bottle of wine between us and a pizza on the way. Sarah had cleared her evening schedule without question, pushing aside a client presentation to be fully present for my crisis. It was the kind of friendship that made David's betrayal sting less. I'd been investing my emotional energy in the wrong person, but the right people had been there all along. Tell me about her, Sarah said gently. Jessica, interior designer. Beautiful in that intimidating, put-together way. She's probably everything David thinks I should be. What do you mean? I took a long sip of wine, trying to organize thoughts that felt scattered and sharp. David's been trying to upgrade me for 3 years. Subtle comments about my career choices, my clothes, my interests. I thought he was trying to help me become more successful, more sophisticated. But really, he was trying to turn me into someone else entirely. And Jessica is that someone else? Apparently. She appreciates vintage jewelry, by which he means she wanted my grandmother's necklace. She's successful in a field that complements his. She probably doesn't embarrass him at work functions by talking about nonprofit funding or social justice issues. Sarah made a disgusted sound. God, Elena, he really did a number on you, didn't he? What do you mean? Listen to yourself. You're talking about your passions like they're character flaws. Your work matters. The fact that you care more about helping people than making money isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's what makes you extraordinary. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone speak about my choices with admiration rather than tolerance. In David's world, my grant writing was a hobby I'd hopefully outgrow. In Sarah's eyes, it was evidence of integrity and purpose. I've been diminishing myself, I said, the realization hitting me like cold water. For 3 years, I've been making myself smaller to fit into his vision of what a successful relationship looks like. And now I remember who I was before I met him, and I like that person better than the one I've been trying to become. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Jessica is upset, but I'm working on getting the necklace back. Can we talk about this rationally tomorrow? I showed the message to Sarah, who rolled her eyes. Rationally, as if you're being irrational for wanting your stolen property returned. I typed back, have the necklace here by Friday or I'll report it stolen. His response was immediate. You wouldn't. Try me. Sarah grinned. Now that's the Elena I remember from college. Remember when that professor tried to give you a B+ on your thesis because he disagreed with your conclusions about women's labor during the Depression? I had documentation for every claim I made. Exactly. And you fought him all the way to the department head until he admitted your work was A-level and his bias was showing. I'd forgotten about that incident, buried under years of David's subtle erosion of my confidence. But Sarah was right. I'd never been someone who accepted unfair treatment quietly. When had I started being so accommodating? I think I lost myself gradually, I said. Each compromise seemed reasonable in isolation, but they added up to me becoming someone I don't recognize. Relationships require compromise, but not capitulation. There's a difference between meeting in the middle and erasing yourself. We ordered Thai food to go with the pizza because Sarah believed heartbreak required multiple food groups. As we ate, she told me about her latest dating disasters, her struggles with a difficult client, her plans to adopt a rescue cat despite her landlord's pet policy. Normal friend conversation, the kind I'd been starving for without realizing it. I haven't been a very good friend lately, I admitted around midnight when we were both slightly wine-drunk and philosophical. What do you mean? I've been so focused on David, on making our relationship work, that I've neglected everything else. When's the last time I asked you about your life without immediately turning the conversation back to my relationship problems? Sarah considered this. Probably about 18 months ago. The honesty stung, but I appreciated it. I'm sorry. Apology accepted, but Elena, that's what happens when you're in a relationship with someone who makes you feel like you have to earn their love. You become so focused on being worthy that you forget to actually live your life. Is that what I was doing? You tell me. When's the last time you wrote fiction? You used to always have a short story or novel excerpt you were working on. I couldn't remember. David had made comments about my creative writing being indulgent and impractical, suggesting I focus my energy on more lucrative forms of writing. Gradually, I'd stopped setting aside time for the stories that had once felt essential to who I was. When's the last time you volunteered at the Literacy Center? Another abandoned activity. David had complained that my volunteer commitments took away from our time together, especially on weekends when he wasn't working. When's the last time you went to visit your parents without David? I'd been taking him on every visit home for the past 2 years, despite the obvious tension between him and my family. My parents were too polite to say anything directly, but I could see their confusion about why I'd chosen someone who seemed so different from their values. God, Sarah, I gave up everything that mattered to me. Not everything, you're still doing the grant writing. Only because it pays well enough to contribute to household expenses. David tolerated it as long as I was bringing in income. We sat in silence for a while, processing the scope of what I'd lost while trying to make David love me the way I needed to be loved. But underneath the sadness, I felt something else stirring. Anticipation. The world suddenly felt full of possibilities I'd been ignoring. I want to start writing fiction again, I said. Yes. And I want to go home to visit my parents by myself so I can actually relax and be myself. Even better. And I want to find an apartment with character, not just expensive furniture. Somewhere I can hang my grandmother's pictures and display my books and have plants that don't fit a decorating scheme. Now you're talking. I pulled out my phone and started making a list. Things I want to do now that I'm not dating David. It included everything from take a pottery class to learn Italian to adopt a cat with a ridiculous name. This is the longest I've seen you smile in months, Sarah observed. She was right. Despite the betrayal, despite the heartbreak, despite the uncertainty of what came next, I felt lighter than I had in years. The life I'd been living had become too small for who I really was, and David's betrayal had given me permission to break free from constraints I'd been accepting as normal. Can I stay here until I find my own place? You can stay here as long as you want, but Elena? Yeah? Don't rush into anything. Take time to remember who you are when you're not trying to be someone else's ideal woman, and then build a life that fits that person. I fell asleep on Sarah's couch that night, wrapped in a quilt my grandmother had made and surrounded by books Sarah had collected from library sales and secondhand shops. It wasn't elegant or sophisticated or photographically perfect, but it felt like home in a way David's apartment never had. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that matches difficult conversations. I'd taken the day off from work, knowing I'd need time to collect my remaining belongings from David's apartment and hopefully retrieve my grandmother's necklace. Sarah had offered to come with me for moral support, but I wanted to handle this alone. Not out of pride, but because I needed to prove to myself that I could navigate difficult situations without requiring rescue. For too long, I'd been allowing other people to fight my battles, or worse, avoiding conflict altogether. David had texted the night before, "I have your necklace, we should talk about the future." I'd responded simply, 2 p.m., I'll be quick. I spent the morning apartment hunting online, scrolling through listings for one-bedroom places I could afford on my freelance income. The options were smaller than David's place, older, with quirks like radiator heating and original hardwood floors. But they had something his apartment lacked: personality. By 1:30, I was standing outside the building that had been my home for 3 years, looking up at the windows of the fourth-floor unit where I'd tried so hard to belong. The doorman, Carlos, greeted me with the same warm smile he'd been giving me since I moved in. "Good afternoon, Miss Elena. How are you today?" "I'm well, Carlos. Thank you for asking." "Will you be moving out? I saw you with luggage earlier this week." News traveled fast in a building this size, but Carlos had always been discreet about residents' personal lives. The fact that he was asking directly suggested David had already informed the building management about our separation. "Yes, I'll be finding my own place soon." "I'm sorry to hear that. You brought a nice energy to the building." His kindness almost undid my composure, but I managed to thank him and make my way to the elevator. Standing outside the apartment door, I took a deep breath and used my key for what I knew would be the last time. David was waiting in the living room, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater I'd given him for his last birthday. He looked tired, older somehow, and I felt a flicker of sympathy before remembering why I was there. "Elena, thank you for coming. Do you have my necklace?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet jewelry box, the kind expensive pieces come in. My grandmother's necklace lay nestled in white satin, looking strange and diminished in such formal packaging. I took the box and immediately transferred the necklace to my palm where it belonged. The relief of having it back was overwhelming. I fastened it around my neck with shaking fingers, feeling the familiar weight settle against my throat. It was like recovering a piece of my identity I hadn't realized was missing. "How was Jessica about returning it?" David's jaw tightened. She was disappointed. She'd grown attached to it. "And you explained that it wasn't yours to give?" I tried to explain the situation delicately. "The situation? Is that what we're calling theft now?" "Elena, I know you're angry, but—" "I'm not angry, David. I'm clear." I looked around the apartment, noting which items I still needed to collect. "I came for my things. I'd like to be efficient about this. We don't have to rush. I was hoping we could talk." "About what?" "About us, about whether there's any way to work through this." I studied his face, looking for genuine remorse or insight into what had gone wrong. Instead, I saw the same confidence that had initially attracted me, now tempered with confusion about why his usual charm wasn't working. "David, what do you think there is to work through?" "The affair was a mistake. I can commit to ending it completely, to being transparent about my whereabouts, to couples counseling if you think it would help. And what about the fundamental issues in our relationship? What do you mean? What do you mean? What do I mean? David, you didn't cheat because you were unhappy with specific aspects of our relationship that we could fix. You cheated because you wanted someone different from who I am. Someone more like Jessica. That's not true. Isn't it? Tell me what you love about me. Specifically. The request caught him off guard. He opened his mouth, closed it, then sat down heavily on the couch. I love how thoughtful you are, how you remember small details about people, how you care about causes that matter. You love how I take care of you and don't cause problems. Those aren't the same as loving who I am as a person. That's not fair. David, you spent 3 years trying to change everything about me that makes me who I am. My career, my interests, my style, my priorities. The only thing you appreciated about me was how accommodating I was to your preferences. I never tried to change you. I walked to the hallway and pointed to the one photograph of my grandmother that I'd been allowed to display. You hated this picture. You called it too personal for guests to see. I just thought you hated when I talked about my family's stories. You called them dwelling on the past. Elena, you hated my volunteer work, my creative writing, my preference for small restaurants over expensive ones, my tendency to get excited about things you found trivial. I was enumerating these points not to hurt him, but to make myself remember why leaving was necessary. You didn't love me, David. You loved the potential you saw in me to become someone else. He was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if I was finally getting through to him. Maybe you're right, he said finally. Maybe I did want you to be more successful, more ambitious. More like Jessica. Yes, maybe more like Jessica. The admission hung between us, more honest than anything he'd said in months. Thank you for saying that. So where does that leave us? It leaves us grateful that we figured this out before we got married or had children. It leaves us free to find people who love us as we actually are, not as projects to be improved. I walked to the bedroom and gathered the rest of my belongings. My grandmother's quilt, my collection of poetry books, the small wooden jewelry box my father had made. Each item felt like a piece of my identity I was reclaiming. David watched from the doorway as I packed. I do love you, Elena. Maybe not in the way you needed, but I do love you. I know you do, in your way. I folded the last sweater and zipped the suitcase closed. But love shouldn't require me to become smaller or quieter or more convenient. It should encourage me to become more fully myself. Is that what you think you'll find? Someone who loves your stubbornness and your impractical career choices and your attachment to old family stories? There was a note of derision in his voice that confirmed everything I'd realized about our relationship. To David, the things that made me who I was were flaws to be tolerated rather than qualities to be cherished. Yes, I said simply. I think I will, and if I don't, I'll still be happier alone than I was trying to be someone else. I walked to the front door, then turned back. David was still standing in the bedroom doorway, looking lost in a way I'd never seen before. David, I hope you and Jessica work out. I really do. You have similar values and goals, and she seems to appreciate the life you want to build. But if it doesn't work out, I hope you learn to love the next woman exactly as she is. Elena, wait. But I was already walking toward the elevator, my suitcase in one hand and my grandmother's jewelry box in the other. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished steel. The woman looking back at me looked older, sadder, but somehow stronger than the one who had moved into that apartment 3 years ago. On the ride down, I touched my grandmother's necklace and thought about the story she'd told me when she gave it to me. Her own grandmother had worn it when she left an abusive husband in 1923, walking out with nothing but the clothes on her back and the necklace around her throat. She'd worn it when she started over in a new city, working as a seamstress to support herself and her daughter. She used to tell me that the necklace reminded her that she came from a long line of women who had survived difficult times, my grandmother had said. Women who had chosen dignity over comfort, independence over security, truth over peace. When life got hard, she would touch that necklace and remember that she had the strength of all those women inside her. Standing in the lobby saying goodbye to Carlos, I understood what my great great grandmother had felt, the mixture of sadness and relief, loss and possibility, the strange lightness that comes from choosing yourself over the easier path. Take care of yourself, Miss Elena, Carlos said as he held the door open. I will, I promised. And for the first time in years, I meant it completely. And 6 months after leaving David, I was sitting in my own apartment, a one-bedroom place in a converted Victorian house with hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves, and windows that actually opened. The rent was half what David paid for his modern unit, but the character more than made up for the lack of granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. I'd painted the walls warm colors, sage green in the bedroom, deep blue in the living room, and hung my grandmother's photographs wherever I wanted them. My books filled the built-in shelves, arranged by subject rather than color coordination. Plants crowded the windowsills, thriving in the southern exposure. On this particular Saturday morning, I was working on a short story while my rescue cat, Fitzgerald, supervised from his favorite spot on the radiator. I'd adopted him from the shelter 3 months earlier, drawn to his dignified demeanor and the fact that he'd been returned twice for being too independent. We seemed perfectly suited to each other. My phone rang, interrupting a particularly difficult paragraph about a woman discovering her own strength. Sarah's face appeared on the screen, grinning widely. Elena, are you busy? I have news. Good news or bad news? Good news. Great news, actually. Remember that grant proposal you wrote for the domestic violence shelter? The Morrison Foundation application? They were supposed to announce decisions next month. They announced early, Elena, you got it, the full amount, $200,000 over 2 years. I nearly dropped my phone. The Morrison Foundation grant was one of the most competitive in the nonprofit sector, and I'd spent weeks crafting the perfect application for Safe Harbor Women's Center. Are you serious? Dead serious. Margaret from Safe Harbor called me because she couldn't reach you. She was crying, Elena. Happy tears, but still crying. This grant is going to allow them to expand their emergency housing program and hire 2 additional counselors. I sank back in my chair, overwhelmed by the news. Since leaving David, my grant writing business had flourished. Without the constant undercurrent of apologizing for my career choice, I'd found new confidence in my abilities. I'd taken on more challenging projects, raised my rates, and started specializing in applications for organizations serving vulnerable populations. This is incredible. This is life-changing money for them. It's life-changing for you, too. Do you realize this is the 3rd major grant you've secured in the past 4 months? Elena, you're building a reputation as one of the best grant writers in the region. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment, processing the news. The woman who'd been afraid to advocate for herself in her relationship had somehow become someone who could advocate powerfully for others. It was as if leaving David had unlocked a version of myself I'd forgotten existed. I called my parents to share the news, something I'd been doing more often since the breakup. My mother answered on the second ring, and I could hear my father in the background working in his woodshop. Elena, how's my favorite daughter? Your only daughter, Mom, and I'm wonderful. I have news. I told her about the grant, about the expansion it would fund, about the women and children who would have safe housing because of the proposal I'd written. My mother listened with the kind of engaged attention I'd missed during the years when every phone call had to be scheduled around David's preferences. Oh, honey, I'm so proud of you. Your grandmother would be too. I keep thinking about what she used to say about the women in our family, about choosing dignity over comfort. She'd love that you're helping other women do the same thing. And, Elena, your father and I want you to know how proud we are of the way you've handled everything this year. Not just the career success, but the personal growth. You seem more like yourself than you have in years. After dinner, I walked to the small neighborhood park where I'd started volunteering as a reading tutor for adult literacy students. It was something I'd wanted to do for years, but had never made time for in David's carefully scheduled world. My student tonight was Maria, a 53-year-old woman who'd emigrated from El Salvador as a teenager and had been too busy working multiple jobs to learn to read English fluently. She was determined to get her GED so she could qualify for a better job at the hospital where she worked as a cleaner. How are you feeling about the practice test? I asked as we settled at our usual picnic table. Nervous, but good nervous. Like when my daughter was born, scared but excited. We worked through reading comprehension exercises, Maria's confidence growing with each correctly answered question. At one point, she looked up from the practice booklet. Miss Elena, can I ask you something personal? Of course. You seem different from the other volunteers. More, how do I say it? Like you understand what it's like to start over. I touched my grandmother's necklace, considering how to answer. I do understand. I had to leave a situation that wasn't good for me and build a new life. It was scary, but it was worth it. Maria nodded knowingly. My grandmother used to say that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing. Your grandmother sounds wise. She was. She came to this country with nothing but her children and her faith. She used to tell me that courage isn't not being scared. It's being scared but doing what you need to do anyway. As we worked through the rest of the lesson, I thought about courage and the different forms it takes. Maria's courage in pursuing education, while working 2 jobs and raising 3 children. My grandmother's courage in preserving family stories and traditions through decades of change. My own courage in walking away from a relationship that was slowly erasing who I was. After our session, I walked home through streets lined with old houses, each one unique, each one someone's attempt to create a space that reflected their values and dreams. David's apartment building had offered luxury and convenience, but no personality. My neighborhood had character, quirks, and a sense of community I'd never experienced in his sterile high-rise. Back home, I opened my laptop and started writing. Not a grant proposal this time, but a story about a woman who inherits her grandmother's jewelry box and discovers that each piece carries the memory of a moment when a woman in her family chose courage over comfort. It wasn't autobiography, but it drew from the well of experience that had been inaccessible to me when I was trying to be someone else. Fitzgerald jumped onto my lap, purring as he settled in for the evening writing session. Outside, I could hear neighbors talking on their porches, children playing in the street, the ordinary sounds of people living authentic lives in spaces that belong to them. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, I wondered if it might be David, but the message was from someone else entirely. Hi, Elena. This is Marcus Rodriguez from the Community Foundation. Sarah gave me your number. We're looking for a grant writer for a major education initiative, and your reputation precedes you. Would you be interested in discussing a long-term contract? I stared at the message, recognizing the name. Marcus Rodriguez ran one of the most prestigious nonprofit organizations in the city, and their education initiatives were known for their innovation and impact. A year ago, I would have been too intimidated to respond. Now, I typed back confidently, I'd be very interested. Are you available for coffee early next week to discuss the details? His response was immediate. Perfect. Monday at 10 a.m.? There's a great little place called Cafe Luna downtown. I smiled, thinking of Mrs. Chen and the corner table where Sarah had first shown me the photographs that changed everything. The place where my old life had ended was about to become the place where a new opportunity began. I know it well. I'll see you there. As I got ready for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the one who had lived in David's apartment. Same features, but everything else had changed. My hair was longer, unstyled in the way David had preferred. I wore less makeup, more comfortable in my own skin. Most importantly, my eyes held a confidence and contentment that had been missing for years. I touched my grandmother's necklace as I did every night before sleep. Thank you, I whispered to the women who had worn it before me, for showing me that leaving can be an act of love. Love for yourself and for the person you're meant to become. In bed, with Fitzgerald curled beside me and the sounds of my neighborhood settling into quiet, I thought about the phone call I'd received that afternoon and the meeting scheduled for Monday. About Maria and her determination to build a better life for her family. About the women and children who would be safe because of the grant I'd secured for the shelter. 6 months ago, I'd thought my life was falling apart. Now I understood that it was actually falling together, arranging itself around the person I'd always been underneath the compromises and accommodations. David's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been liberation. I'd kept my dignity, and in doing so, I'd found my life. 1 year later, I was back at Cafe Luna, but this time I was the one with news to share. Sarah sat across from me, her eyes bright with anticipation as I pulled a magazine from my purse. Elena, stop being dramatic and tell me what's in there. I opened to the marked page and slid the magazine across the table. There, in the regional nonprofit quarterly, was a two-page feature article titled Rising Stars in Grant Writing, Elena Vasquez's Mission-Driven Approach. Sarah grabbed the magazine and started reading aloud. In just 1 year as an independent consultant, Elena Vasquez has secured over $2 million in funding for organizations serving vulnerable populations. Her success stems from what she calls authentic advocacy, deeply understanding an organization's mission and translating that passion into compelling narratives that move donors to action. Keep reading, I said, grinning. Vasquez credits her success to a personal philosophy she learned from her grandmother, that dignity and integrity are more valuable than comfort or convenience. This approach has earned her contracts with some of the region's most prestigious foundations and a waiting list of organizations hoping to work with her. Sarah looked up, tears in her eyes. Elena, this is incredible. You're being recognized as one of the top professionals in your field. It gets better. Read the last paragraph. Currently working on a book about the intersection of personal narrative and social justice advocacy, Vasquez splits her time between grant writing and creative writing. She recently completed her first novel, a multi-generational story about women's resilience, which is being reviewed by several publishers. Sarah set the magazine down and reached across the table to squeeze my hands. A book deal? Elena, why didn't you lead with that? Because I wanted to savor the moment. Remember when you told me I should take time to remember who I was when I wasn't trying to be someone else's ideal woman? Yes. Well, I remember now. I'm someone who believes stories have the power to change the world. Someone who thinks helping others is the best possible way to spend a life. Someone who values authenticity over appearances and purpose over profit. And someone who deserves to be loved exactly as she is. I smiled, thinking of Daniel, the environmental lawyer I'd met at a fundraising event for the literacy program. He was nothing like David. Quieter, more thoughtful, genuinely interested in my work and my stories about my grandmother. He read my creative writing and offered feedback that made my work stronger. He volunteered alongside me at the reading program and never once suggested I could be spending my time more productively. Actually, there's one more thing, I said, pulling out my phone to show Sarah the latest photos from my parents' house. I went home last weekend to help Mom organize Grandma's things, and we found this. The photo showed a wooden box filled with letters, all addressed to my grandmother in my great-great-grandmother's handwriting. She saved every letter her grandmother wrote to her after she left her husband. Sarah, they're full of advice about building a new life, about finding strength you didn't know you had, about the importance of never settling for less than you deserve. Are you going to include them in your book? Some of them, but more importantly, I'm going to share them with the women at the shelter. Stories of survival, of women who chose difficult but necessary paths and built beautiful lives on the other side. Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying my face. You look happy. Really. Genuinely happy. I am. Not in that giddy, temporary way, but in a deep, sustainable way. I wake up every morning excited about my work. I go to sleep every night in a space that feels like home. I have friends who know and love the real me. I'm writing stories that matter to me. I'm helping people in ways that feel meaningful. And David? I'd run into him a few months earlier at a downtown restaurant. He'd been with Jessica, both of them looking perfectly polished and successful. We'd exchanged polite greetings, and I genuinely wished them well. Jessica was wearing expensive jewelry, not my grandmother's necklace, which she'd apparently found too simple for her taste. David seems happy with Jessica. They're getting married in the spring. How did that make you feel? Relieved, mostly. They're well suited to each other in ways he and I never were. I hope they build a good life together. No regrets? I touched my grandmother's necklace, feeling its familiar weight against my throat. In the past year, I'd learned more about the women who'd worn it before me. My great-great-grandmother had lived to be 97, supporting herself as a seamstress and raising her daughter alone. My great-grandmother had been a teacher who'd fought for women's suffrage. My grandmother had worked as a nurse during World War II and later started a community garden that still existed in her old neighborhood. No regrets, I said firmly. Everything that happened led me to where I am now. And where I am now is exactly where I'm supposed to be. As we finished our coffee, Sarah pulled out her phone to take a picture of me with the magazine article. For posterity, she said. I want to remember this moment when your book wins awards and you're giving speeches about the power of authentic living. You're getting ahead of yourself. Am I? Elena, you've built an extraordinary life in just 1 year. You've helped countless people through your work. You're writing stories that matter. You're in a relationship with someone who celebrates who you are instead of trying to change you. Most importantly, you've learned to value yourself the way the rest of us have always valued you. That evening, I sat in my apartment working on the final chapter of my novel. The story followed 4 generations of women in a family, each facing moments when they had to choose between safety and authenticity, between comfort and growth. It was fiction, but it drew from truths I'd learned not just from my own experience, but from the women I'd met through my work. Maria, who'd earned her GED and been promoted to hospital administrator, the residents of Safe Harbor who'd rebuilt their lives after leaving dangerous situations, the literacy students who'd gained the confidence to pursue dreams they'd deferred for decades. Fitzgerald was curled in his usual spot on the radiator, and classical music played softly from the vintage radio I'd found at an estate sale. Through my windows, I could see the lights in my neighbors' houses, each one representing someone's attempt to build a life that reflected their values and dreams. My phone rang, displaying Daniel's number. How's the writing going? Good. I think I'm finally ready to send the manuscript to agents. That's exciting and terrifying. Both, but mostly exciting. I was thinking about what you said last week, about how leaving David taught you the difference between being loved and being accepted. I've been wondering if I tell you often enough that I love your writing, your passion for justice, your terrible habit of rescuing injured birds, your tendency to cry at insurance commercials. I laughed. You tell me plenty. Good. Because I never want you to doubt that you're loved exactly as you are. Not as some improved version of yourself, but as the woman who argues with the TV during political debates and keeps books on every horizontal surface and believes that chocolate chip cookies can solve most problems. After we hung up, I returned to my writing, but Daniel's words stayed with me. For 3 years with David, I'd tried to earn love through constant self-improvement. With Daniel, love felt like coming home, comfortable, accepting, encouraging of growth, but not demanding change. I wrote until midnight, finally completing the novel that had been inside me for years, but couldn't emerge while I was trying to be someone else. The last scene featured the youngest woman in the family wearing her great-grandmother's necklace as she walked away from a situation that no longer served her, carrying nothing but her dignity and her faith in her own strength. Before bed, I checked my email and found a message from my literary agent. I'd signed with her 3 months earlier based on the first 3 chapters of my novel. Elena, I have wonderful news. I just heard back from Beacon Press. They want to publish your book. The editor said it's exactly the kind of story the world needs right now. One that shows women they have the power to choose themselves, even when it's difficult. Can we talk tomorrow about the details? I read the email 3 times before it sank in. My book, the story I'd been afraid to write while I was with David, the novel I'd only found the courage to complete after learning to value my own voice, was going to be published. I walked to the window and looked out at the quiet street, thinking about all the women who might read my story. Women who were questioning whether they deserved better. Women who were afraid to leave comfortable but diminishing situations. Women who needed to remember that they came from long lines of survivors and thrivers. Taking off my grandmother's necklace, I held it up to catch the light from the street lamp outside. 4 generations of women had worn this simple piece of silver, each finding strength in the knowledge that she was connected to something larger than her individual struggles. Tomorrow, I would call my parents to share the news. I would celebrate with Sarah and Daniel and the friends who had supported me through the most difficult and transformative year of my life. I would begin planning for a future that felt bright with possibility. But tonight, I simply stood in my own space, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived authentically. Books I'd chosen, art that spoke to me, work that mattered, relationships that nourished rather than diminished me. I was exactly who I was meant to be, and for the first time in my adult life, that felt like enough. More than enough, it felt like everything. I fastened the necklace around my throat, feeling its familiar weight settle against my skin. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to choose courage over comfort. But I was ready for all of it. I had kept my dignity, and in doing so, I had found my life.